Okay, so far we've been talking about someone who wanted to deny that there are any standards at all. There's nothing but the way you see it, your group, your community, your own personal way of seeing things. And we've pointed out that in the public world, where calculation and observation can settle what the facts are, it's a non-starter to think that it's up to you to decide. For me the earth is flat, or for me germs don't cause disease, or so forth and so on. Bullets don't really kill. All those people are just pretending, and later on they go back, they ship them off to Zambia where they lead normal lives, and things like that are really absurd. And then we talked about the idea of values, morality, ethics, and values. And we said that there's no good reason to think that there are no standards. A person who waves his hand and says that's only cultural, if you ask him to support his view that it's only cultural, he can't say anything that leads to that conclusion. And I suggested something which is my own idea, that you could set at least some limits on how far it could go, because you're working with the concepts that we're working with. We're talking about describing another culture in our terms, and our terms have meanings. So that's where we got to so far. Today, someone asked me, maybe it was you asked me, I don't remember. Someone asked me, but what about areas of life where we think there aren't any standards? I was fighting with someone who says there are no standards at all, and I'm saying there are some standards. But maybe there are some areas where there aren't standards. Maybe some areas that really are just cultural or personal, and there's nothing to be said about one view being right or wrong, true or false, better or worse. It really is relative or subjective. I think it's correct there are some such areas of life, but maybe not all of the ones that people take for granted. And I want to start with one which I think if you'll ask people whether it's subjective or not, you'll get almost a unanimous chorus, of course it's subjective, and that's aesthetics. Great art versus mediocre art versus terrible art. And they'll tell you, you're just expressing your preferences. There's nothing intrinsically that makes Shakespeare better than Dickens. They both wrote what they wrote, and they appeal to different people, and people get out of it what they want, what they find interesting. There's nothing there, whether it be Beethoven or the Beatles. It's just a question of what you like. Now we'll be taken for granted. I don't think that's correct. And I learned this, what I'm going to tell you now, from John Stuart Mill. I think it's a very important lesson in things that seem obvious and clear and perfect, and everybody agrees on them, and they could be, in fact, dead wrong. Let's start with the idea of praise, praising something. Great cue, great art, great catch in football, great knot for tying for your sailboats, something that's great. Now, when I say it's great, am I just expressing my approval? Expressing my excitement, expressing my inspiration, expressing my awe? Or is there something objective going on there? So let me take an extreme fantasy for you to hopefully make this point. Imagine you meet a person who has never heard of basketball. Never heard of it. You've never heard of basketball. Let me show you something. I mean, it's a piece of the world which has a lot to teach you, and it can be a lot of fun. So you take them to a basketball game, you get to the court early, and you take up your seats, and the players are on the court and shooting baskets and so forth and so on. All of a sudden, he grabs your arm, and he said, "Did you see that? He jumped into the air and he threw the ball while he was in the air. And the ball went into the hoop. He made a jump shot from the foul line. Congratulations. He said, what a great shot. That was amazing. What do you say to him? Listen, that's not a great shot. There are high school kids who can do that. You just don't know because you haven't been around basketball. You don't know how. Maybe in the course of the game you'll see 2 or 3 great shots, but that wasn't a great shot. When you say it's a great shot, you're making a mistake. What you said was incorrect. Well, anything about which you can be wrong, any statement that can be incorrect, isn't subjective. It's objective. Something makes it correct, and you could be wrong in your judgment about it. Well, it doesn't depend upon you then. Not just that you're committed to it, that that's how you feel. That may be how you feel, but it's just not right. So, maybe when we talk about aesthetics, great art, great music, great poetry, maybe there's something there also. Now, John Stuart Mill suggests the following criterion. Let's suppose we're talking about Beethoven and the Beatles. Let's suppose, this might not be true, but if it's true, then it will have a conclusion. Imagine that everyone who can understand both Beethoven and the Beatles prefers Beethoven. What does understand mean? I know the emotions that are being expressed. I can see where they repeated the theme, only they repeated it a little bit higher to give it a little more attention. I see that the expression of the notes fits the meaning of the words. The words aren't arbitrary. You show that you understand what the Beatles are doing. You understand how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and what effect it has. And the same is true with Beethoven. You understand the structure of the piece. You understand why he used this instrumentation rather than that instrumentation. The structure of a symphony, the relationship between the various movements of the symphony. Everyone who understands both Beethoven and the Beatles prefers Beethoven. Well, why is that, do you think? It means if you meet a person who says, I prefer the Beatles, you can bet good money that he doesn't understand Beethoven, because everybody else who understands both prefers Beethoven. Doesn't that indicate that there's really something in Beethoven that the Beatles don't have? Let's imagine that you're such a person. You enjoy the Beatles, you've listened to Beethoven, for 23 minutes in your entire lifetime, and 2-minute stretches, and you don't see what's so great about it. And then you find out that there are millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people who can understand both Beethoven and the Beatles, and they all prefer Beethoven. Wouldn't that make you stop and think, hey, maybe there's something there that I'm missing? Maybe there's something there that's worth my investigating, because maybe I'll get something better than what I have. Let me give you another instance of the same thing. This goes back like 30 years. You got a kid who grows up in Dubai. Nothing but sand in every direction for 500 miles. Now, he sees on television people with long wooden boards on their feet, and they're slipping and sliding down the side of a mountain which is covered with white stuff. Man, they're going fast. I've read that people get injured when they do that sometimes, and it looks cold. Why would anybody do that? Maybe they're political prisoners who are being tortured. Why would anybody do that? But then you look at the expression on their faces, and they look happy. And you find out that to pay for residence in a hotel in the Alps and spend 2 weeks skiing costs a lot of money. So you think, well, maybe there's something there. After all, they're human and I'm human, right? I have lots of money because we sell oil here. It's not a problem for me to go to Switzerland. Maybe it's worth my trying because it looks like they're getting something out of it that there's no reason why I couldn't also get. And he's right, isn't he? There is something there which, unless he's uncoordinated, or he certainly could get something that he isn't getting. So maybe there is something objective about the superiority of one art production over another one if everyone who can understand both prefers one to the other. Now, when I say objective, it means there's some quality of human experience that's available and which leads people to prefer one over the other. So, in a sense, this is the judgment of people who are having the experience, that's true. But if everybody who can understand both prefers this one, then it seems like for people's enjoyment or inspiration, this one is superior to that one. You have people who are critics of performances. Let's say an opera critic. He goes to the opera and he sits there with his laptop, and as they're singing and playing and acting and costumes and all the rest, he's typing up tomorrow's column for the newspaper. The next day, people read his column. Why do they bother? If it's just a question of he enjoyed himself, why should I care that he enjoyed himself? Or he, more than anybody else, he had his experience, and if I went, I'd have my experience. No, but you see, he's listened to hundreds of operas. He's listened to dozens of performances of this opera. He can pick out the superiority and inferiority of the operas. And if I want to go to an opera that has a rich performance, one from which I can learn things, one from which I can be elevated, I want the report of the opera critic because he can tell me that, because he has more experience. So he knows it better. So his judgment is a better founded judgment, like everything in life. The more you know, the more experience you've had, the better founded your judgment is. So maybe the area of aesthetics isn't just a matter of, I happen to like this and you happen to like that. Maybe there are facts that are relevant to the possibilities of human experience, objective in the sense that they are across the board, people share them, and that being the case, aesthetics shouldn't be thought of. It's just a matter of what you desire. In the last 100 years, where there's been a lot of communication, a lot of shared experience, certain types of music have had a worldwide impact. Jazz has traveled very widely over the world, even to cultures where it wasn't invented, and it's had an effect on those cultures. Classical music for certain people, even though they are members of a different culture, I just now got the Mozart piano sonatas played by a Japanese fellow who grew up in Japan and whose musical education was only in Japan. His name is Maosh Fujita, and his playing is superb. Mozart was German, and his cultural creation is a European cultural creation. Yeah, but he got it. He really got it. And I know because Chaim Salinger agrees with me. So his grasp of classical music is superb. So maybe the idea of aesthetics isn't an area where it's just a matter of how you feel and it's just a matter of a cultural product. Maybe there are also objective standards. So again, we're finding that the idea of objective standards can be applied even more broadly than perhaps we thought. We're together so far? Okay, now, a few times ago, someone asked about gender fluidity. Is that a matter of, there's two things. There's the statement that there are 14 or 54 or 104 genders, as supposed to be a statement of fact about the world. And then there's the, I identify as this gender or that gender. Whether that has a meaning that could be an objective meaning. Now, I think that something we said at the outside, we said a few days ago, we have to start with here. When a person says something and when you hear the words, it sounds bizarre, the first thing you should ask him is, what do you mean? I credit you with intelligence and with seriousness. You're saying PQR?
the way I use those words, that just doesn't make sense. It's just either obviously wrong or nonsensical. So I suspect that you and I don't mean the same thing by the words. And if I understood what you mean, I would understand better what you're trying to say, and I would have something to talk to you about. Otherwise, the way it comes across now, like the person who says there are no tables. So what are you going to do if he says there are no tables? Say, have a nice day. I can't talk to you if you think there are no tables. There's no place to get started from. So if a person says there are 5 genders, so I say, well, let's see. I classify people into XX and XY chromosomes. But of those, there are only 2. So it doesn't sound like you're talking about what chromosomes the person has. He says, right, you're right. It's not chromosomes. I said, well, let's see. I understand that a person can have surgery and change their bodies in such a way that, although the chromosomes are one way, the structure and functioning of the body is the other way. Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about a person who, in terms of chromosomes, let's say, is male, but now has a female body, so it's male chromosomes and a female body. Is that what you mean when you say it's a new gender? Well, they talk about gender fluidity without any surgery. So it can't be limited to that. There's got to be something called gender which can be applied without changing your bodily structure at all. Well, I say, now I'm beginning to lose track of what's going on here. Maybe you mean something like this. You know, some girls grow up, and the term that was used to be used, I don't know if they still use it anymore, was that she's a tomboy. Meaning that she enjoys activities which statistically are more usually males' activities than females' activities. She enjoys sports, she's aggressive, she may like fighting, and so forth and so on. So is that what you mean? You mean she's chromosomally a girl, and in some ways she behaves like a girl, but in other ways she behaves like a boy. Is that what you mean? They probably would include something like that, but they would object to saying she's a girl liking boys' activities. No, what they want to say is she's really a boy. So now I say, well, she's really a boy. I'm not sure I understand what that means. She has girls' chromosomes. She has a girl's functioning body. She likes boys' activities. But that's not enough. She's not a girl liking boys' activities. She's really a boy. What do you mean when you say she's a boy? What do you mean? This is why Ketanji Brown, the newest Supreme Court Justice, when asked by the Senate to define man and woman, said, I don't know how to do it. Yeah. She doesn't know how to define man and woman. She's going to be she is now a Supreme Court Justice, and she can't define man and woman. Isn't that a little strange? And the answer is, well, I want to protect a person's right to say, I'm a man, but I don't want to put any limitations on it. I don't want to put any criteria on it. So that if you say, I'm a man, I have to support that, and I have to agree, I have to admit to that and agree to that, even though it doesn't have any meaning, it doesn't say anything. Because if to say I'm a man were to say something with concrete content, then she would be able to define what it is to be a man. What it is to be a man is to have those criteria, that criteria applied to you. It has that particular content. That's why she can't answer it. But what is she protecting? Well, she's protecting the right, the privilege, the authority for someone to say the words, I am a man, and to be treated as such, treated as such, because the person said it. Even though, if you ask the person, what do you mean when you said it? There's no explanation there.
Well, what does it get you? It gets you the right to play on women's sports teams and win all the battles because you have a male body and a male upbringing and so forth and so on. It gets you the right to use private places which belong to women. If you say, saying I'm a woman, right? You're a man with a male body, you're saying I'm a woman, right? Because you say the words, but you can't tell me yourself what you mean by the words. I gave you several alternatives of descriptions we all understand, we all can agree on, and you said they're not right. So then, what's left? So now begins to sound like it's just a label which gets you certain privileges, but has no other criteria for its application. Should I respect that? It's like somebody saying, I'm going in through that entrance. Why? Because I want to. It's an entrance for only American citizens? Too bad, I'm going anyway, because I do what I like. Really? So he says, because I identify as an American citizen, and you can't tell me what I am. Well, actually, I can, because you're not an American citizen. You weren't born in America, and you're not a naturalized American citizen, so you aren't an American citizen. You can't be what you are just by saying you are. That's because there are criteria. Here, you want to use let's say a man wants to use the facilities that are usually open to women by saying the words, I am a woman, or I identify as a woman. If those words have no content, they don't describe any facts, then they don't get you the privileges. You don't get the privileges because you pronounce the syllables. There might be features that are appropriate for that, but there might not. It depends upon what it is that you're trying to say. So here, I think the problem is a radical problem. Yeah, there are no standards because there's nothing for there to be standards about. This is a little bit like someone says that chocolate ice cream is superior to vanilla ice cream. The taste is superior. I don't think he can describe what superior means. Here, I think all you have is that some people like chocolate and some people like vanilla. So if he says it's superior, I have to ask him, what do you mean by saying that it's superior? And I would contrast that with wine. Because wine, especially expensive wine, has very subtle tastes. And there's definitely something objective going on because I can take 2 cups of wine and give you a taste of each one back and forth, and you can't. If I cover them, you can't tell which is which. And when I do that with George, he gets the difference right away, and he gets it right every time. So clearly there is a difference in the taste. You're just not getting it. So now we're back to John Stuart Mill's thing. If there are people who get it right, then there's something there to be gotten right. And if you don't get it right, it means you're not tasting it. You're missing out on something that's really there. We don't seem to have that with chocolate and vanilla. People taste both of them, like one, and some people like one, some people like the other one, and there doesn't seem to be anything there that's being missed out on. There are different qualities of chocolate, and you can definitely distinguish between, simple chocolate and high-grade Swiss quality chocolate, and there most people can tell the difference. So not all tastes are the same in this respect. And with respect to being a man or being a woman, there's no criterion at all. That's like chocolate and vanilla, and therefore nothing's being said. That's one problem with that attitude. The other problem is, even if there were something being said, can you create the fact by simply saying I identify as? Now here, there's a lot of justified humor about this. One fellow who went in and said, my birthday was 65 years ago, but I'm not 65 years old. I identify as 45, and I'm not quitting my job. Even though there's a law that says that at 65 you have to retire, but I'm not 65, I'm 45, because that's how I identify. Really?
can you identify your age and just be that age? There's a fellow who does interviews on college campuses, and he asks the students questions. And he asked the following a pair of questions, which this was at UCLA. The students are supposed to be bright there. And he tied them up in knots. He first started to talk to them about cultural appropriation, dressing up in somebody else's culture, which is supposed to be something which is unjust and insensitive and so forth and so on. And one of the standard things is blackface. There's putting black coloration on your face to portray yourself as a black. And even for Halloween, you're not supposed to do that. And then there are people who did it over decades, pretending to be a different race. One of them was almost in charge of a racial group. And when challenged about it, she said, "Well, I was born in the wrong body. Really, I'm brown. I'm not white." So this person asked the college students, "Can you do that? Can you really identify with another race and make yourself into another race?" No, you can't do that. That's taking over their culture and taking over their racial identity, and you can't do that. He said, okay. Now let me ask you about another such practice called woman face. Woman face? What's that? That's when a man dresses up like a woman and says he's a woman. He puts on long hair, he puts on lipstick, doesn't change his body, puts on dresses and so forth and so on. He's a trans woman, right? Why isn't that taking over another person's reality, another person's sexual identity, by pretending and putting on makeup? Why isn't that just as bad? Gee, I don't want people to pretend to be black or pretend to be brown or pretend to be Native Americans, but I do want people to be able to pretend to be members of the other gender, sex, whatever you like. How am I going to do that? One person even said, you can't do it with race because race is genetic. And then said, but, pretending you're a woman, that's okay, right? I said, but, well, isn't that also genetic? XY, XX chromosomes, structure of the body, and all the rest? And she couldn't answer. So this is similar to what I said a couple of weeks ago when I was a professor. A mantra that you heard from students a lot was, on the one hand, if you're telling them about good and evil, just and unjust, and so forth and so on, they'll tell you that values are relative. Don't force your values on me. I don't have to live the way you live. I live by my own values. But then, when you shut down one of their demonstrations, they'll tell you you're violating my rights. Maybe when I said that, I don't know if that was so obvious that that's a contradiction. Let me tell you an article that was in the Wall Street Journal. Now, I read about this article before I was old enough to read articles, but it was a very interesting article. A student in a philosophy class, they're studying about values, absolute values and relative values and so forth and so on, and he writes a paper arguing that all values are relative. And the professor gives the paper an F. A student comes storming into the professor's office. That does happen from time to time. Why did you give me an F? And the professor says, because you're wrong. So what do you mean I'm wrong? Prove to me that there are absolute values. So the professor gives this proof and this proof and this proof and this proof. And the student says, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that. I don't accept that. I'm not committed to that. Each one of the proofs the student rejects. So at the end, the student says, well, you see, you couldn't prove it to me. I guess you're going to change my grade, right? And the professor says, no, because here's my value. I pass people who agree with me, and I fail people who disagree with me. That's my value. The student says, but you can't do that. It's not fair. Oh, you can't do that because it's not fair. Hey, weren't you the one who argued that all values are relative? That nothing's objective, nothing's absolute? How can you tell me what I can do? How can you tell me what's fair? Now, I think that if you read that story, on the one hand, you identify with the student who's clearly a victim here. It's really wrong for professors to fail people who disagree with them. But on the other hand, I think you have to criticize the student's logic. If you really believe that values are relative, then you can't use the values to tell somebody else what he can or cannot do. He just doesn't share your values. That's what was going on with students when I was a professor. The whole motivation was psychological. And the motivation was, get out of my way. Get off my back. Leave me alone. So if you try to tell me what values I ought to live by, what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust, I say, values are relative, don't push your values on me. But if you shut down my demonstration, then I say, get out of my way, get off my back, don't trample on my rights. My goal is to get you off my back. I'm not consistent, doesn't bother me too much. Whatever argument works at the moment, that's the argument that works. So the same thing's true as here. You want to protect people's authority on themselves to decide what they are. But on the other hand, you don't want to have people behaving in a way to belittle somebody else's culture. And not always can you have both. So you choose whichever one you want at the moment, and then use that. But it's not consistent. It's psychologically consistent. You're making space for people to do things, but you're not doing it with principles that are consistent. You're just saying what suits your psychological needs at the moment. So I think the idea of this idea of gender fluidity and the rest of it, the challenge will be, what do you mean when you say you identify as this or that? And if you can't say what you mean, and it can't be defined in any of the terms that we understand as descriptive and factual, then you're just using the word to get an advantage. And certainly, there's no reason why I should respect you and reinforce what you're doing. You've heard of these Burning Man festivals? They put out a list of their principles. I heard this on a lecture by Ben Shapiro. I think Ben Shapiro is pretty good. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's pretty good. And 3 of their principles are, number 1, you get to be whatever you identify as. And the second principle is everybody should support everybody else's personal identification. And the third is live for the feeling of the moment. Whenever you have a moment that gives you a good feeling, that's a success. Now, this idea that I identify as I please and everybody has to support my identification, that's like the pronouns. Use the pronouns that I choose. Why? Why should I? Basically, the answer is because that's what I want. Well, I don't want. Must I do everything you want? Don't you respect my choice of my pronouns? No, actually, I don't. Why should I? I don't think that that's the right way to use pronouns, and I will not speak the way you tell me to speak. Why should I speak the way you tell me to speak? Can I tell you how to speak? No, you won't accept that. So who are you to tell me how to speak? Why won't you show me the basic respect of giving in to a preference which means nothing to you? So Jordan Peterson's answer is, I'm a clinical psychologist. And I know what reinforcing impulses like that does to people, and it's not always good. And if I'm committed to do good to other people, that will include not always doing what they want. If you want a bottle of gin, shall I give it to you because you want it? I don't think so. Maybe you're an alcoholic. Maybe it's not good for you. And maybe giving in to the pronouns that you want isn't good for you, actually. And I won't do it because it's not good for you, whether you want it or not. And if you want to know about respect, I respect you because I want what's good for you. That's how I respect you. Not by doing what you wish I would do. That's like a 4-year-old who just wants what he wants. If he doesn't get it, he throws a tantrum. You don't show respect for the 4-year-old by giving everything that he tantrums about. That's not respect. So the idea that you can, by just saying so, create a fact with age, I mentioned it before, with citizenship. You've heard of the furries? These are people who, to some extent, identify like animals. They have conventions where they all dress up like animals, and they present themselves as animals. Someone said, I don't have to pay taxes. I'm a bear. Bears don't pay taxes because I identify as a bear. You can identify as having a different gender. You can identify as, but you can't identify as being a bear. Why not? Who said so? Where does identification stop? What makes identification work? So I think that here there are standards of making sense with the words that you use, and there are standards of creating facts, and there are standards of whether or not what you want you should be given. And those are all standards that they're objective. Now, remember, to say that they're objective doesn't mean that everyone gets them right. We may have to change our minds on these things because we tried and we made a mistake as to what the standards are, what meanings are. You can always change your mind. But changing your mind is not the same as saying that there's no right or wrong. On the contrary, as we said the other day, changing your mind means there is such a thing as right and wrong, and I got it wrong. And now I'm going to change my mind to get it right or get it at least better than it was before. So here are areas where I think that there are standards, and they aren't. Things are not fluid. So the areas of life where there really aren't standards are fairly few. Fairly few. Areas where there are choices and people who are equally competent in both disagree about their choices. They don't disagree about what's better or what's worse, but they just disagree about their choices. Those will be areas where it's fair to say, I think, that there are no standards. That's why vanilla and chocolate are like that. Or checkers and chess. In objective standards, chess is much more complex, much more difficult than checkers, but that doesn't make it a better game. There's many people who can play both, and many of them prefer checkers, and many of them prefer chess. So it's there. I don't think there's anything to make it into something objective.
Not in chess, that there's more pieces, like more functions and more things.
So again, there are differences that are objective, but that doesn't necessarily make one into a better game than the other. That's the difference. It takes real imagination to appreciate the game of Go. Because I think almost all Western games and competitions are based on groups with different roles, working together, coordinating their different roles together. And in Go, you got a big board with holes and beads, marbles, and you just put them in and take them out. That's all you do. One guy has white marbles, the other guy has black marbles. They're all exactly the same. And the holes are the same, except some are on the edge and some aren't on the edge. The idea is to surround the other guy's group of marbles and then take them off. The complexity grows as you put the marbles in the holes, but they're all marbles. It's all either yes or no, white or black. That's all there is. It's an entirely different kind of complexity. And you say one is better and one is worse. I don't think you could say such a thing. You can see how people's minds would be very difficult to be good at both, I think. Because in the one case, you're working with different roles and how they interact with one another. If the knight protects the queen and the queen attacks the castle, so then you have a structure where you could probably win some points. But here it's just another marble, another marble, another marble. So that, I think, is the bottom line with respect to standards and truth and objectivity, and with at least the things that we discussed. Yeah.
I mean, I see that we are facing like the voice and the opinion of coming from ignorance, also for art, like art is a very good example that I like it more because whatever I don't know about those both structures of art, but from what I know, this one kind of makes me feel more attracted to, and it's gained a lot of field in the world that like even people get aggressive, and it's like in the sense of when we tell someone, it's not just about opinions. There is like objective facts.
Mhm.
They it can get to very violent,
Yeah, people.
emotional.
No question. I'll give you an example. I would ask such a person this question. You have a national endowment for the arts, okay, and they support painters. Right? Why isn't it done like this? People paint paintings, and they bring them in to a warehouse, and there's a random procedure for picking out paintings and giving monetary grants to the people who painted those paintings. Would you suggest we should do it that way? Since there's nothing really better or worse about one painting or another, so it's just prejudice if you decide to give some money to this guy and no money to that guy. It should be done randomly. Does that sound right? Maybe not. Maybe this one's got a new technique that nobody else thought of. And by promoting it, a lot of people will learn a new technique and they'll be, And again, I mean, I started out, my parents, Alei Michelle, did a valiant effort to make me sensitive to art. They took me to museums. It absolutely did not go. It did not go. I was boring, and I couldn't stand it. My first wife was good at that, and she, among other things, and she taught me to appreciate art by enabling me to see what's in the picture. So I realized afterwards, I just wasn't seeing the picture. I was looking at the canvas, but I wasn't seeing what was there. For example, Van Gogh was one of my favorite painters, and she said to me once, the perspective in Van Gogh is all wrong. The bigger things, the smaller things that were supposed to be in the distance, doesn't follow the rules of perspective. So I would first, you're insulting my favorite artist. How could you do that? So I took a look at it, and it's true. It's true. He didn't put perspective into his art. So now I have to ask, was that a weakness? He just wasn't good at it? Or did he mean to communicate something by having mistakes of perspective? What would that be? And when you figure that out, and then you see, well, it always works this way, and the flowers are always the ones that are most prominent, and the hills are less prominent, so then you appreciate what's on the canvas better than you did before. And when you do that, you say, well, these painters produce paintings for which study of this kind pays, because you get much more from it after you see it with that kind of explanation. And the other ones don't have that kind of depth because there's nothing to explain. You look at it, study it, talk to people who know it, and they can't bring you any more richness from it than is there at first glance. So they say, well, okay, there's more in this painting. And again, people who are competent at both can tell you what's going on in both paintings, all prefer this one over that one. So then there's something objective there that's going on in the one case and not in the other case. So if they don't agree with John Stuart Mill, let them figure out an answer to what he's saying. To the way I explained it. But I do think, if you think about supporting artists, it's not going to be done, I don't think anybody wants it to be done randomly. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they would think that any other way of doing it than random is just prejudiced and it has no validity. But then I think that what we pointed out shows that that's not correct. Okay, I want to move to a different logical subject, which again is a subject that plays a very big role in discussion and argumentation. I have mentioned it obliquely a couple of times without emphasizing it. And that is burden of proof. Burden of proof is a term that comes from American law. Maybe it's true in other types of law. And there's a big difference between criminal law and civil law. You may have heard of O.J. Simpson and the murder case, and so forth and so on. And O.J. Simpson was declared innocent in the criminal case, but declared guilty in the civil case and had to pay a gigantic fine. So what's going on? Is he innocent? Isn't he innocent? Is he guilty? What exactly is going on? Now let's take a criminal case. So the guy's accused of a crime. There's a prosecutor and a defense attorney. What's the job of the prosecutor? It's to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty. What's the job of the defense attorney? Not to prove he's innocent. That's not his job. His job is to show that the prosecutor hasn't made his case. There's a gigantic difference between the two of them. Let's put it in probability terms. The prosecutor has to show that the guy is guilty with 80% or more probability, and the defense has to show, let's say, that he's only guilty with 60% probability, not 80. And 60, there's a reasonable doubt, and therefore he's not going to be declared guilty. He's still got a majority of evidence against him. That's right, but it isn't beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution didn't make his case. That's all the defense attorney has to show. The job of the defense is much easier than the job of the prosecutor. That's why Simpson was declared innocent in the criminal case, because there was a reasonable doubt, and he was declared guilty in the civil case because the majority of evidence was against him. It's just that it wasn't a big enough majority of evidence to cancel a reasonable doubt. So standards are different in the two. In a civil case, each of the two attorneys has the same job, to show that there's a little more evidence on my side than the other guy, and then the other side. They're equal. They're equal. But in a criminal case, it's not true. Now, when you are discussing an issue, debating an issue, so what tends to happen is there's a lot of both going on at the same time. Part of what you're doing is trying to prove your side is correct, and part of what you're doing is rebutting the other guy and showing that his information isn't good enough to convince. And they aren't equal, and they don't have the same standards. So my recommendation, when you're having a discussion, if you can achieve agreement with the other side, is to say, listen, we're discussing about Q. I think Q is true, you think Q is false. Let's decide to do it in 2 stages. Either I'll start or you start. You want me to start? I don't mind. I'll take the responsibility to show that Q is true, and you play the role of defense. Just point out weaknesses in my argument, which would mean that I didn't succeed in showing that Q is true. And then we'll reverse. We'll change places. So let's see how it works out. I'm putting out reasons to believe Q, so that Q is true. And if I succeed, we should agree that Q is true. He's showing my reasons aren't good enough. If he succeeds, what should we agree? We should agree that neither of us knows whether it's true or false. That's what we should agree. Because I failed to prove it. I failed to show that it's true. Okay, so that doesn't mean it isn't true. It just means I failed to prove it. At this point, we should both confess ignorance. He's shown me that my proof isn't strong enough. It isn't good enough. Doesn't convince. So I should back down. I should say, okay, I'll have to admit I didn't prove it. I can't prove it, so therefore maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's wrong. But the other guy can't say, so now you have to agree with me, because he didn't present any evidence for his side at all. All he did was show that what I said on my side is too weak to convince. So I think that's the way the argument should progress. One side takes responsibility to prove it, and the other tries to weaken his argument so that it doesn't prove it, and then switch sides. And if you don't, you come to credit moves in the argument that aren't correct, are really illegal. They're where they throw down the foul flag on a football play. And I'll show you that tomorrow, where if you don't pay attention to who's got the responsibility, the burden of proof, and who's only attacking it to show that it's too short, then moves in an argument which shouldn't be made are made, and they carry false strength and this goes in ethics, and it goes in certain types of science, and it goes in politics, and it certainly goes in religion.
Okay, we'll pick that up tomorrow in session.